So just to be respectful of everyone's time and also our speakers, we'll begin. We'll have more people join us as our program goes on. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is staying warm this afternoon in Dallas, Texas. It is 24 degrees, so we're experiencing some snow. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce our moderators. So Dr. Daraj is a professor at TCU. He teaches development, international relations, Middle Eastern studies, and foreign policy. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, and also he's an associate here at the SMU Towers Center. So Dr. Raj, I will turn over to you.
Thank you very much for organizing this series. I always call you not so invisible hand behind our lecture series and success of it so far. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, and I welcome all of you, and I want to encourage your participation. We're going to allow about 20 minutes or so for question answer periods and for your comments, so they're most welcome. Our speaker today, and we are delighted to have him, and I want to thank him for taking off his very busy schedule to have an audience with us today, is Dr. Khalid Abu Ismail, who received his PhD from New School for Social Research in New York City. And he's a senior economist on poverty and human development at the United Nations and Middle East and North Africa Economic Research Forum Policy Affiliate. Formerly, he was a UNDP, Arab States Poverty and Macroeconomic Policies Advisor, and a faculty member of the Economic Department of the Lebanese American University, a very distinguished institution, I might add. And he is the lead author or co-author of 20 UN flagship publications, including World Development Challenges Report, Arab Vision 2030 Report, Arab Development Challenge Report, Arab Middle Class Report, Rethinking Economic Growth, Arab Multidimensional Poverty Report, and Rethinking Inequality in Arab Countries. So I always thought that this was an area in which research was underdeveloped, so to speak, and we need to fill a gap because the topic is enormously significant and is assuming even more significance. And Dr. Abu Ismail is going to join us from Lebanon, and he was just reporting to me that Lebanon has experienced a rate of poverty that is now 80%. So he's not only well equipped conceptually to share with us his insight, but he's also in a position to have a lot of first-hand observation to share with us. So without any further ado, I give the floor to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Abu Ismail. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Daraj. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. It's 8 o'clock in the evening in Beirut, and I would like to apologize beforehand if there's a lousy connection. But as so many things here in Lebanon, we are experiencing also difficulties with connectivity and likewise. Anyways, let me try to share my screen and see if you can see this in the background.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll try to speak for the next half hour or 40 minutes or so in trying to give a broad narrative. As you know, when we're speaking about development challenges, one really has to be broad in the perspective. And you know, I worked with UNDP, and I come from a school that looks at development from a rather comprehensive angle. So it's really human development that is at the forefront of our attention here at the UN. And I'll speak a little bit about the narratives that come with this perspective, the different competing narratives, because there are so many different stories that can come out. And it really depends on what you're measuring and how you're measuring. And I will then turn to the more mundane but still important issues related to income, poverty, and growth, before moving on to inequality, structure transformation, and decent work. And then finally, ending with a fiscal space and some concluding remarks. Now, the sequence is deliberate, and you'll see why in the course of my presentation. So let's start with a human development story. Now, I'm assuming that all of us are familiar with the Human Development Index of UNDP, which basically measures human development in terms of achievements in 3 areas: income per capita, education attainment in terms of average and expected years of schooling, and health in terms of life expectancy.
You're frozen. We can't hear you. Dr. Abu Ismail, you're frozen. We cannot hear you. Hello? Bora?
I think his connection got lost and he is going to sign back in.
Okay.
Everyone, so sorry. Yes, he's going to log back in.
He's speaking to us from Beirut, and
yes, he's speaking to us from Beirut. So
and the connection is poor.
Mm-hmm.
As many things in the country doesn't work right now, then probably internet is one of them.
Yes. So let me. Sorry, everyone. We will be.
Farah.
Oh, there he's back.
Wonderful.
Sorry, my apologies, but I did warn that there was a problem with the connection. Let me go back to the presentation.
Perfect. And you can keep your video off just to sometimes the connection always works that way better.
Yeah, that's what I'll do. But just to make sure that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can. Mm-hmm.
Which for some reason doesn't want to turn into a slideshow. Sorry, just let me try again here. Okay, does this work now?
Oh, we don't have your photo, your video.
But you can see the screen.
Yes, we can. So if that works better, please go ahead.
Yes, I will try to speed it up a
Yes.
little bit.
What is
Okay,
important?
so basically we've got a story with most of the Arab countries either in very high or high human development, with only 4 countries, most of them in LDCs and conflict affected countries, at the low level of human development, and Morocco, Iraq, and Syria actually at the medium level of human development. This is according to the 2019 report. Now, progress, while not as glamorous as the 1970 to 2010 human development report story, if some of you may recall, this was a big story back in 2010. UNDP did a hybrid HDI in which they try to measure progress worldwide over the past 4 decades, and 5 out of the 10 best human development success stories, according to the HDI, came from the Arab region. Some of them, including Tunisia, were countries that were subsequently affected by the so-called Arab Spring. And what that showed was clearly that the HDI was capturing some very limited aspects of as I said, the broader human development concept. But still, we still have decent enough rate of progress from the year 2000. I mean, it's slightly less than the world average, and even more than, or at least the same rate of progress as other developing regions.
Forgive me
now
for
let's go to
interrupting
the
you.
other.
If you
Sure.
want to share with us your slides as you speak, please do so.
Oh, you don't see the slides. I thought you were seeing the slides.
No, we just see the first one.
Okay, so for some reason this is not showing again.
That's okay. If
No, but I do want to share the slides. It's very important to share the slides. So
sure, then please do. You
just
were on
don't
the
know.
slide on development graphs. That was slide number 5. So you can go to 6 now if you like.
Okay, but so now do you see the slide?
No, forget it. Then just speak.
with
We hear your voice in a distorted fashion.
this
Please
slide
just speak.
global MPI, or you don't see that?
No, we don't see that. That's okay. You can just give a lecture. That would be fine. It's out of your hand, and we understand it.
Okay,
Now we see it.
Okay, so now you see it. Okay, all right. So if you can see this, then basically the slide I'm about to show you is about the global multidimensional poverty index, which captures, it's a flip side of the human development index, and it basically captures deprivations in access to health, education, and living conditions. And you can see some progress happening in most of the Arab countries as well. It's maybe less than the world average, but 2 things to notice here. First, for most Arab countries, you've got very low levels of deprivation, and you've got declining trend over time. So whether it's the Human Development Index, or whether it's the MPI, or even if you go to other indicators like $1.9, which is typically used as a measure of income poverty, you do see success. So what drives these results? Why? I think that's an important question that we can start looking at. Of course, we are talking about basic human development achievements here. I don't know whether you can see this particular slide. It's a scatter plot that basically took us about 6 months of work, and each point there is an indicator. So we're looking at indicators of stunting, 6 years of schooling completion rates, primary schooling completion rates, skilled attendance of birth, infant mortality, secondary schooling, etc. And on the upper left quadrant is where you want to be, where you basically look at higher rates of achievements, annual rates of achievements, and reducing inequalities between the rich and poor. So as you can see, most countries on most indicators manage to be there in that quadrant. meaning that alongside these higher achievements on these basic indicators of health and education, you've had declining inequalities between the rich and poor. Of course, that's not the case for all indicators, for all countries, but for the majority of indicators on a majority of countries, that is what has been happening. And particularly remarkable is the reduction in inequalities in secondary education completion. Why is that important? Because it's secondary education that gives you access to socioeconomic mobility. That's your one indicator where you want to invest as much as possible, because that empowers your youth and basically allows you to have a human base capable of undertaking structural transformation. In the earlier 2000s, if you came from a poor family, on average in the Middle East, North Africa, you were 6 times as likely not to have completed your secondary education. That ratio dropped to around 2.8 by the time we got to around 2018. So it's again an example, along with many other indicators, of inequalities between rich and poor eclipsing over time. And that's a good thing. And of course, when we look at the other kind of inequality that matters is rural, urban, and gender disparities, which have also been closing for these indicators over time. So basically, one story that comes out of the statistics is that you've got these outcome inequalities improving in most of the basic social indicators, social indicators. But does that mean that we've now reached low levels of outcome inequalities? Does it mean that we have more equal opportunities? Not really. And I'll give the example of education, since I think it's one of the most important indicators. The first point to make is that even and despite the significant reductions in inequalities, the level of inequality between rich and poor in education is still amongst the highest worldwide and far above what you see for the global average, 30–40% above global average. And the second thing, which is even more important, is that when you measure inequality in opportunities in secondary education, which as I mentioned, is extremely important, it's not only very high, but it's also rising. What does that mean? It basically means that when we look at the factors that influence the opportunities, things like the gender, factors that are outside your control, like the education level of the household head, the area which you live in, the wealth of the family, these factors make up to 60% of more of the explanation of the outcomes that we see. And their role is increasing over time, particularly family wealth. So that's as far as our story is with the traditional perspective on human development. Now I want to take you to our World Development Challenges report, in which we try to add 3 things to the story. The first thing is we want to qualify these human development achievements. So we want to look at the quality of income, the quality of health, the quality of education, not just the quantity of it. We also want to bring in the sustainability angle, and we want to bring in the governance angle. This is about 2 years of work that'll be published soon, and it will culminate in what we call a Development Challenges Index. Now, the interesting thing about the Challenges Index is that you're measuring challenges or shortfalls and not achievements. So the closer you are to 0, the better you are. It means you have lower challenges. The closer you are to 1, the worse you are, because it means that you still have a lot of challenges. And we've got 3 components here. One is the governance, one is the sustainability, and one is the quality adjusted human development. And all of these sub-indices take 1/3 of the weight to make what we call a DCI, or Development Challenges Index. There are the indicators. If you're interested, I can share with you the technical paper that went online a few days ago that has all of the technical details on how we constructed this index. But basically, we have 21 indicators, each with an equal weight, and covering issues like quality adjusted health, education, income. We measure the quality by looking at the distribution of income, climate change, energy efficiency, environmental health like sanitation, drinking water, air quality, democratic governance and government effectiveness, which is a very interesting angle as well to look at. Not just, your rule of law, institutional accountability and participation, but also the effectiveness of government in delivering quality public services. When you do that, you come up with a picture, which I'm hoping you're able to see, that is very different, strikingly different than the one that I just showed you. None of the Arab countries are characterized as very low or low in terms of development challenges. All of them are either at a level of medium, high, or 3 countries actually are at a very high, along with only 29 countries worldwide. The other thing is that progress over time is far less glamorous than when you use the HDI. And the third thing to note is that governance appears to be a driving force. It's the single most important challenge driving this index over time. In the Arab region, compared to other regions worldwide, governance is really the most important issue here. Now, as I said also, that when you look at progress over time, the region is far less than what you would expect given the regular Human Development Index. So that's basically the story on the revised human development narrative. Now let's go to the money metric poverty, income poverty. Again, I'm assuming that you're all familiar with the $1.09 a day, which is the favorite World Bank story on income poverty. And you can see that, generally speaking, after 2010, the Arab region has basically stagnated in terms of reducing poverty. And it doesn't matter whether you use the $1.09 a day or if you use the $3 a day. In fact, after 2021, the Arab region becomes almost the second poorest region after sub-Saharan Africa, regardless of how you measure poverty, regardless of if it's a $1.09 a day, $3 a day, $5 a day. And that's a very important remark. It basically says that this region has an income poverty problem and it's stagnating, as opposed to the glamorous story that you've had with basic human development indicators. When it comes to basic income poverty indicators, like the $1.09 a day or the $3 a day, after 2010, it's been a flat line. Now, of course, the story differs on the sub-regions. If you go to the conflict-affected countries, that's where the rise in poverty is most visible. But even for middle-income countries, you hardly see a dent since 2010. And so it's a regional story that's not just affected by conflict-affected countries. It's also the bulk of the middle-income countries where the demographic rate is where you also witness this problem. And if you shift to national poverty lines, the story is more or less the same. So it's not like because we're using these, one fixed PPP, $1.09 or $3 a day. If you even use the national poverty lines, you still get more or less a similar story. So what's driving this? Is it an income inequality problem? Because we know any change in poverty is the result of two things. It's either the result of an inequality effect or it's a result of a growth effect. Well, it certainly doesn't seem to be an inequality problem if you look at this graph, because most of the countries in the region have lower Gini's than the global average. And in fact, the Gini's have been declining slightly over the past 20 years. If you go to the PovCalNet World Bank database and you dig out the nuts, what you'll get. So pretty much lower than average income inequality according to the Gini index. But this figure and this story comes out of household surveys, right? And household surveys report growth in the income of households, and that's how we measure poverty. But is that the case when you look at national growth, you know, the GDP growth. And so the story here, I think, which explains a lot of the woes that develop the economic problems of the region, is that the growth that we've seen at the GDP or GNI level in private consumption expenditure, the stuff that you get from the national accounts, is very different than what you get from households. And in fact, the ratios, and I hope you're seeing this, for the Arab region is the lowest worldwide. So what we call the pass-through from national growth to household growth is very low in the region. And that's a key issue that one has to bear in mind. So the question is, why do you get this low growth trickle down? And the argument I will make is that you need to look at two things. You need to have a closer look at inequality from a different angle, using different measures. And you also need to look at the labor market. So this is, thanks to Piketty and his company, another inequality story, which basically looks at the top incomes shares using other data sources that comes from fiscal data, that comes from other sources. And when you do that, it turns out that the Middle East and Arab region is the highest inequality worldwide in terms of the shares of the top decile, the top 10%. And when you look at, and there's a paper coming out next week to corroborate, when you look at wealth inequality, you'll also see the same thing. And in fact, the Arab region over the last 2 years has witnessed the highest rate of wealth inequality increase in the world. So the typical median resident in the region saw their wealth, or his or her wealth, decline by 28% by the end of 2020. Whereas the wealthiest 1 and 10% saw their share jump from 37 to 45% if you're the wealthiest 1%, or from 75 to 81 if you're the wealthiest 10% of the region. These are staggeringly disturbing, high and disturbing numbers. So the other story that we need to look at to explain this low trickle down is that the growth pattern didn't create enough decent jobs. I mean, sure, we've seen these two figures if we're students of Middle Eastern economies, where we have the highest youth and overall unemployment rates, and we have some of the lowest labor force participation rates in the world, especially for women. But is it a problem of not having enough jobs? I would argue no. I would argue that's not the case, especially when you look at the average employment growth elasticities. You do produce jobs. It's just that these jobs are not concentrated in decent, high value added sectors. Most of the jobs, most of the growth went to low value added sectors like the other service sectors, internal trade and construction sectors. This is where most of the employment, I would add, the informal employment has been generated. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Arab oil rich or Arab oil poor countries. That pattern has been systematic. And if we look at the employability in the formal sector, you can get more proof of that, because here you've got an opposite story where you have low elasticity. So the formal sector hasn't been able to create jobs. And of course, even within the formal sector, many of these jobs are also not quite decent if we use the ILO definitions of social security protection, insurance, etc. And the implication is, and predictably, that you have a huge productivity challenge. Systematically, Arab countries, Middle Eastern countries, but Arab countries in particular, have had very low and declining labor productivity rates, which is also reflected in the complexity index. It measures how much your economy is knowledge-based. How much is it able to utilize its knowledge in exports and in production processes? Almost all of the Arab countries, with the exception of Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, and Lebanon, are below this regression line that basically says that if you look at the level of income, all of the Arab countries are below what you would expect in terms of the regression line, in terms of their economic complexity. So that's, again, and some of the oil-rich countries are extremely below that line. They're the outliers here, if you look at the red dots. So this is a huge problem, especially when you consider that you've got to create around 65 million jobs by 2030. And you know, that's under the assumption also that you want to increase the female labor force participation rates, which are dismally low compared to other regions. Now, the question is, why do we have this high inequality, low private sector, decent job creation? And here where it gets a bit interesting, because there's a bit of a debate on this issue. Some people, myself included, would argue that most of the macroeconomic policies of the past 4 decades were focused on, and especially during the last 2 decades, were focused on stabilization and inflation management. And in some cases, such as Lebanon, the country where I'm at right now, they were designed to induce rentier and speculative capital flows. And in that case, in this situation, it's hard to blame poor trade and industrial policies, because you're not giving industrial policies the level playing field to undertake a structured transformation or to induce investment and growth to go to the higher value added sectors where you can capitalize on the human capabilities that were developed in the indicators that I showed on education previously. And then you've got the skills mismatch stories, the supply side stories, the quality of education and labor market rigidity stories, which is basically most of the literature that comes out of the World Bank and some cases also the ILO, which I would say is also important. But the degree to which it overcomes the importance of the other demand side stories is one that we can maybe disagree on. And then finally, you've got your governance, crony capitalism, private sector crowding out stories. And along with that, you have the political instability stories. Now, of course, all of these are playing different roles in explaining these outcomes. And it's up to us to decide on which one is more important. And I would argue that this is where you need to go down to the level at the country level and use your judgment. Finally, in terms of stylized facts, let's look at what's happening now and what's probably going to have the most important constraint on countries' ability to respond to these challenges, the fiscal space story. Well, we've seen debt rising faster than most of the growth rates, especially for the non-oil rich middle-income countries. And this has been a trend over the past 2 decades, I would say, and in most Arab countries, and not just in middle-income countries, and especially in oil-poor countries, which basically means that debt service is also rising rapidly, and especially for these net oil important countries. And that seems to be not just something that will stop. It seems to be with the projections that we're having, whether from the IMF or whether from our UN projection models, that these fiscal deficits that come with these high debt payments is going to be sustained for the coming few years, even in GCC countries, and especially also when you add the impact of things like high military expenditures. Now, especially for the oil exporters, the other complication is that the oil prices are all over the place. Now they're going up, but you know, last a couple of years they were hovering from $40 to $70, which is significantly lower than the break-even prices for some of, or many of these oil-rich countries. So a lot of the GCC countries need the oil prices to go above $65 in order for them to be able to not have fiscal deficits. And it's not clear over the long term whether this is going to happen. In fact, many of the oil experts are suggesting a secular long-term decline in oil prices as a result of many factors that maybe we don't have time to get into, like, for example, renewables and other demand affecting factors. The end outcome is basically that there's a huge squeeze on the ability of Arab countries to respond to shocks, like, for example, COVID-19. And when you look at this graph in front of you, you'll see that the Arab country, compared to its level of income, compared to its, what you have as an image of a region that is oil rich and it has a lot of resources, it really didn't give as much as you would expect in terms of fiscal support to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. And that's the problem. Your fiscal space for development expenditure is dwindling over time. So I come to my last section here, which is basically going to summarize a few thoughts and offer some conclusions. The summary is basically as follows. First of all, there's no question that we've seen a lot of achievements. But these achievements have been mainly focused on basic quantitative indicators. Things like basic health, basic sanitation, primary education, even secondary education. And a lot of it was driven by reductions in inequalities between rich and poor. But still, you have a high level of inequality in terms of at least education. And definitely you also have high levels of inequalities of opportunities that didn't change over time. And that's what I would expect inequalities of opportunities and outcomes to move together. They haven't, and especially in secondary education. Why is that important? Because if you don't fix inequality and opportunities in secondary education, you haven't fixed a lot of the root causes behind the frustrations of the youth that led to the Arab Spring. It was because of the fact that there was a bleak outlook that many of the youth didn't see prospects for capitalizing on their efforts and the gains that they made in their education, that they went out into the streets. Second thing is, when we factor in the quality of human development, the sustainability and governance, when we try to bring in a more broader human development perspective, there's a very different rank and very different story on human development. The region has definitely a much more, weaker development performance, and none of the countries can be ranked as having low or very low challenges. So more or less a reversal of your HDI, typical HDI story. And the governance is definitely your primary challenge. Third challenge is sluggish or rising even in some countries. Income poverty due to a low growth trickle-down effect. Growth that happens at the national level doesn't trickle down to households. Why? You've got two challenges. One, you've got a high level of income and wealth inequality. When you look beyond the surveys, when you actually use different measures than the Gini that you typically have when you look at the income surveys. And second, more importantly, you have very poor labor market and structural transformation outcomes, which is reflected, as I said, in significant challenges in creating decent jobs, especially in the formal private sector. And that in turn reflects into very low productivity. Going forward, there are two other challenges. You've got your demographics, you've got to create millions of jobs, and you've got limited fiscal space and dwindling fiscal space to do it, especially with rising debts and deficits. And finally, there's the conflict challenge, which I didn't talk about because that would take another 2 hours. But it's not difficult to make the case that if you don't address these challenges, you haven't addressed the root causes of many of the conflicts that we see today, or the causes of future conflicts to come. So what do we do? Well, you've got the mainstream story, which is basically focusing on democratic governance reforms and more liberal economic policies. Is this the answer? Well, let me say the following. On the governance side of things, I would say that definitely there needs to be a lot of reforms, and much can be done in terms of democratic governance. Rule of law, accountability, and participation are things that we need to work on. But unless you fix government effectiveness, you might run into the same problems that Tunis, for example, has run into recently, that the public needs to see results delivered on the ground. So it's a focus on democratic governance by itself will not work. On the economic policies, this is what I have to say. I don't think there's much room for the business as usual fiscal consolidation and public sector downsizing, except maybe in the GCC. And why is that? When you look at the level of public sector employment compared to the size of the population, most of the Arab countries actually, and Middle Eastern countries with the exception of GCC, don't have a very high rate as opposed to what you continuously hear in the literature. In fact, they're probably lower than or within the range at what you would expect compared to global averages. But in the GCC, there seems to be a case to be made that there is some reduction that needs to happen in size of public sector. My last slide is that these development challenges are not unexpected. They're closely associated with a political economy of rent, a rentier economy, and the governance structures that come with it, and the failed economic reform policies that also come with it. And along with that comes poor structural transformation. Something needs to happen, especially for oil countries, where we need to rethink fiscal policies. And there are many suggestions that we have, and I don't have time to get into it, but certainly more progressive fiscal policies would, this is the time and to consider them. But the question is fiscal policies for what? And here is where you need to have a rethinking of the whole social contract, which basically is a political and economic process, and it requires new social dialogue. That's, I think, where the entry point would be. But unless, and this is my opinion, and I think I speak for the institution as well that I belong to, that unless you have a regional economic cooperation framework, you're going to lose out on a lot of the gains that you've seen elsewhere. These productivity gains are very difficult, especially for the smaller countries. So we need to have a new deal in the region and a new vision for a regional economic collaboration or economic cooperation framework. Pretty much something like what happened in the post-World War II Europe. And I'm afraid maybe the geopolitical environment is not yet ready for something like this. But that is something that I think would make a huge difference, especially for countries currently in conflict and for the future prospects of the region. And it would definitely require that we end current conflicts. Sorry if I took a little bit more time, and I will stop here. Back to you, Professor Doraj.
Thank you so much for that very empirically rich and analytically thoughtful presentation. As a political scientist, I was also was taken with your conclusion, which were primarily political observations and conclusions about the significant role of governance and regional cooperation and the need for a new deal. All of those are very refreshing. I have two questions myself before we entertain questions from our audiences. First is the story and the narrative that you presented. How does it translate itself politically in this sense? For example, Shibli Telhami, a fellow Egyptian that I'm sure you know, his thesis about the Arab Spring was that you always had levels of poverty, corruption, political repression in the Arab world. What really explains Arab Spring is the primary role of social media, and that help to mobilize the youth, etc. What is your take on that? That's the first question. Once you answer it, then we'll go to my second question.
I agree. I think, yeah, social media definitely played a very important, vital role. And I don't think the Arab Spring in Egypt, the revolution, the Egyptian revolution, could have happened without the role of social media or without us watching what happened in Tunisia. But if you didn't have the structural factors in place, you wouldn't have had the explosion. And I think I would disagree with the fact that poverty, corruption, repression were something of a constant. I would say that no, they have increased, and they've increased significantly because of the nature of the rentier economy, because of the exasperated sense of frustrations by the youth. Because of the demographic transition, the intensity of these factors have increased. And it wasn't just a perception issue, which is, by the way, the World Bank story as well, that you really didn't have much inequality, but the perception of inequality was high. I would argue, and I think based on the evidence that I presented, that you also had a real inequality problem. So yes, and no, I agree that the social media played a very important role, but no, I don't think that that was the most important. I think the most important were the underlying structural factors that form the the explosion, the explosive material. Maybe the social media was a trigger, but it wasn't the root cause of this.
Okay, thank you very much. The second question that I have is, as you mentioned briefly in your presentation, a lot of petroeconomies or oil and gas rich countries, they rely on the rent from oil and gas, on the oil and gas income, to provide a cushion and a semi-welfare for their public. And all the indications are, if we take the Scotland Environmental Summit that we saw a few months back as an indication, 50% of the nations have pledged that they are going to reduce their carbon footprint by 50% in 2030. So if that is something that is likely to come to pass, and Biden administration's new climate and energy transition agenda indicates that US is also serious about all of this and is going to provide some leadership. If that is the case, then what does it tell you about the future prospect for the regional economies absent the massive oil rent that has provided a cushion so far to, if you will, provide a semi-welfare state? In the absence of that, what we may see, given the challenges to diversification of these economies and lack of effective political governance and decision-making, all of that?
It's a very important question. I think I'll go back to Paul Collier's answer to that question. I mean, basically what he says is that it might be the one reason why Arab decision makers, especially in oil-rich countries, might have to go for real reforms, because failing that, the future might be quite bleak. And I think when you look at the rents per capita, because that's really what you need to look at, even back to 2008, it's on a declining trend. And I think they know, a lot of the decision makers know that this is a ticking time bomb. Are they ready for it? This is where I don't know. I mean, it's a hard question, but a lot of the countries would have to really start rethinking not just their fiscal policies, but also their immigration policies. And there has been trends over the last couple of years to indicate that they're more serious about diversification. But whether they're more serious or not is not the only issue. It's whether they can do it and bear the political economy ramifications. Because, as you know, one of the prerequisites for having a diversified economy would be that you need to have appropriate macroeconomic policies and monetary policies in particular. Can you see the prospects, for example, for a delinking between a lot of the currencies of the Gulf states and the US dollars in favor of an export-led economy? Would there be a political environment that would be conducive for such a decision? I'm not sure. I don't know. These are the difficult questions, and I'm not sure I can answer these questions. But unless, and this is just one example, of course, I can give many. I mean, but unless these hard, very tough decisions are made in favor of a developmental state rather than a rentier state, then I'm not sure whether the future will be much different than in the past in terms of the reliance. And therefore, I don't know where these economies will go. But one story would be more poverty, and more pressure on the dwindling middle class, leading them into many of the trajectories that a lot of the middle income countries of the region have seen over the past 20 years.
Yes, thank you. There are two questions and one comment. I will share them with you to get your response and reaction. The first one asks, talking about governance, how do you explain the non-democratic governance in China? Their economy has basically moved ahead as the US by most standards. So
yeah, well, that's a fact. I mean, even in our index, when you explain a lot of the reduction in the global development challenges were driven by China. Just like when you go to the World Bank, the nice story on reducing income poverty worldwide is because of China and India to some extent. Well, China doesn't have a democratic governance system. China is not a democracy. So therefore, the argument is that you don't need a democracy in order to do development. That's a huge debate, and it's a huge statement that I don't think I have the time to get into. I would say that there are varieties of capitalism, varieties of democracies, varieties of relationships, and it's very difficult to argue that there's a one model that fits all countries. And I'm not here to argue that one particular model of governance is more inherently superior to another. But what we argue in the report is the following: that any system, for it to function properly, would need to comply with certain goals, certain end goals. And of course, human rights goals are, and development end by itself. So they are end goals that we need to aspire to. But to function, you need to have a system that complies with rule of law indicators, with participation, minimum level of participation and accountability. And I would argue that China has that minimum in order for it to function. I would also argue that even if it doesn't do as well as Western democracies on these aspects, what we call democratic governance, it does better than many democracies on what we call government effectiveness, which is basically your ability to deliver quality public service, infrastructure, quality public service, health, and education. And you can see that in the pandemic response, they were very efficient. Now, of course, one can argue that this might have come at the expense of other trade-offs, but that's what makes this governance issue a very complex one. It's not an easy question to answer, Professor Doraj. But I would say that at the end of the day, China is not the only model, and it's very hard to replicate that model. China is a very specific case. That would be my nutshell.
Couldn't agree more with your analysis. Yes. The next questioner is asking, education is wonderful, but if the educated are frustrated, that leads to greater unrest, etc., isn't this incredibly positive accomplishment unaccompanied by other accomplishments, one of the greatest challenges the Arab world faces?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, look at the case of Syria. Syria did some amazing gains in terms of education, building up the capacities and capabilities, a la Amartya Sen, of its youth, but it didn't budge a bit on its governance. And the expectations of the youth were unmet, not even at the minimum. So when you combine that with the ethnic situation and the complexities of the fractionalization that you have historically in the country, when you combine that with the competing geopolitical stories, it really unfortunately unraveled into a huge amount of misery and conflict. So that would be, yes, I agree that education builds expectations, especially for the youth, and that along with that, there needs to be a process of structure transformation and governance reforms. That didn't happen. Neither the structure transformation nor the governance reforms happened, and therefore the decent work didn't happen and the expectations were not met. And that's the story behind the Arab Spring. I fully agree with that. But the story is not to have less education, which unfortunately will happen if you go into conflict. The story is to do more structural transformation and governance reforms. That would be my easy or 2 cents answer to this question.
Sure. The next question is, what are you doing to contribute to alleviate misery in Lebanon? I assume the questioner is asking, what is your policy proposal or recommendation to alleviate economic misery in Lebanon?
Well, I mean, one thing we were among the first to call things in Lebanon for what they are. I mean, we basically said the level of poverty in Lebanon, which basically stood at, if you're talking income poverty, around 30% in 2019, now jumping to above 60%. Around 35% if you're doing multidimensional poverty, now jumping to over 80%. And the issue was multidimensional poverty affects things like, access to electricity, garbage collection, health, education, electricity. All of these things have been dramatically affected. So over the span of 2 years, you've witnessed a doubling of poverty using that broader definition. And many people who are not income poor are now basically suffering from one or more of these deprivations. So we advocated, and I think we were quite successful in getting international support, along with very strong messages for the Lebanese government to really get their act together and start looking at the situation on the ground. And I think there was a lot of traction to that. Especially one proposal that we put was to try to create a solidarity wealth fund, because when you capture the level of private wealth in the country, a lot of the Lebanese, especially the upper 10% of the population, have a significant amount of wealth, and a lot of their wealth and income comes from abroad. So with a minor contribution from this group, you will be able to cover a significant amount of what is needed to close the poverty gap, the income poverty gap. So there were these solutions. But the one recommendation we keep on making is that Lebanon's problems technically are not difficult, whether it's electricity, whether it's the water, whether it's these day-to-day problems. It's the governance. I mean, it's a political system that is in shambles and completely unable to provide the basic expectations of its people. So it's a governance issue par excellence, and we keep on repeating that.
One last question, and we will end it with that. One of the members of our audience thinks or raises the question, we already have an example like GCC as a club for cooperation. Why is that not either sufficient, or why is that not optimal in promoting the kind of economic cooperation that you envision for the region?
Because whatever we have, which is not just the GCC, we have the Maghreb area. We also have the League of Arab States free trade area. I mean, we have a lot of these initiatives. In fact, the League of Arab States was amongst the first to create regional initiatives and for regional integration, but they were driven mainly by political incentives and not developmental or economic ones. What we're arguing is that you have a strong case now for developmental targets being the anchor to which this region integrates. And if you start from there and you put the political differences aside, there is a win-win situation for everybody. But getting there will not be easy, because it's making the transition from, as I said, a rentier state to a developmental state. Something that would mean that there will be winners and losers, and you have to figure out a way where you manage the expectations of the winners and the losers, and that's not an easy thing to do.
Thank you so much for that very thoughtful and rich presentation. You give us a lot of food for thought, so we are most grateful for you to share your ideas with us. And my thanks to our audience for their good questions and their engagement. And thanks to Bora Lachi for organizing all of this. And I look forward to our next webinar and next exchange of ideas. But for now, we are done, we are adjourned. And again, we are most grateful to Dr. Abu Ismail for taking the time to share his ideas with us. And we hope this won't be the first time. Now we know how wonderfully you can synthesize theories of economics with empirical observation, and also being in the region, sharing your firsthand observation is enormously educational and beneficial to all of us. Thank you again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Bora. Thank you, Professor Doraj. Thank you, everybody. And I look forward to perhaps seeing you again in the future soon.
Me too. Me too. Very much so.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, thank you so much. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bora.